me show these suckers out.
I mix what I like, what I like, what I like, what I like, what I like. Yes, indeed. What's up, world? Welcome back to another edition of I Mix What I Like right here at Black Power Media. Again, I'm Jared Ball. Very happy to be your host. Please do make sure that you are that you like, share, and subscribe. Make sure that if at all possible, you become a member to the channel. Most importantly, especially given recent events around these YouTube streets, please make sure that you are all linked up with blackpowermedia.org. You can keep up with all of the shows there, all of the social media there, all of the forms and methods of donation there. You can, whatever ever may end up happening with our platform, you can keep up to date with various members and individuals and the platform and the channel itself there. So please, blackpowermedia.org, make sure you're all linked up there. And as I said, please make sure you're all signed up with all of our various social media. So today I was very, after the recent discussion that I had with Dr. Anthony Monteiro, a number of people have reached out for a variety of different reasons. A lot was said in that discussion. And a number of people had reached out around the issue of Marcus Garvey. And frankly, I think one of personally, historically, and since even with this platform and all of my own media work, one of the consistent critiques has been an insufficient focus on Garvey and an insufficient focus on African-centered thought, more broadly speaking. And though I have an affinity for all of that to a certain extent, I admit certain biases may have led me in different directions. But have always been welcoming of discussions of those subject areas and materials and histories, et cetera, and so forth. So there's certainly no effort or attempt to deny that. Yeah, I just lost my train of thought. But anyway, so yeah, so when someone did reach out and send me the piece in discussion today, I admit I was a little bit excited, and for a number of different reasons, primarily because I respect the author, but I also like when my name is called out. I admit that, both for good and bad reasons. I like when people are willing to say, especially when it's respectful. I don't, obviously nobody wants to see their name dragged, but I'm saying, but when there's a respectful calling out and saying, look, Jared said something, I don't agree. This is what he said. This is where he got it wrong. I really do like that. I really, really, really like it. Obviously, I think we all want to be taken seriously, but also I just like the idea that anyone would want to seriously engage, whether it's me or anyone else, these ideas, and be willing to say, look, I disagree with somebody, and to say it with a degree of respect and that is suggestive of a sincere interest in having that conversation, or at least just sharing the criticism. So I appreciated that. And then also, as I was saying, because of some of the response being about the treatment of Garvey in that conversation. I thought it was great that we would have an opportunity to speak with somebody about, beyond just a critique, but being willing to come on and talk about it. So the piece in question is a response to Dr. Anthony Monteiro regarding Marcus Garvey by Dwayne Wong or Omawale. And I just want to double check that because usually we don't bring folks on until the camera is on, but Dwayne, if you're there and don't want to be on camera, that is an option as well. I just want to make sure you're ready before I bring you up. And with that, as is described here, Dwayne Wong Omawale is a Guyanese-born Pan-Africanist and an author. And I would just add to his short bio, I think a very strong writer. I've been reading his work for a number of years, particularly when I first was brought into contact with his work was around whatever year it was when the reverse hashtag people started, bucking and being, I thought our next guest was one of the stronger respondents online to that with sound analytical writing. So his Medium channel or blog is linked in the show description with this piece. So I'll bring him up now. Welcome, Dwayne Omawale, to the program. It's good to meet you and to have you on to the program for the first time. Welcome.
Yeah, thank you. Happy to be on. Been following your work for a while too, over the years, just watching your different videos on YouTube. So very happy.
No, right on. I appreciate that. And I definitely appreciate now admittedly you weren't talking about me, but I appreciate that when my name was mentioned, it was respectful, it was appropriate. And I love it. Like I said before I brought you on here, I think that kind of exchange is great. And anyway, so I appreciate that. Yeah. So I have some questions, but let me let you start. I don't think we need to share the clip here. I don't know if you feel that way. I'm happy to do that if you think, but the clip in question in terms of our exchange, mine with Monteiro, that drew your attention. But I think most folks, if not, it's linked in the show description as well. You can check the whole discussion. But around the 27th minute, Dr. Monteiro basically raises the point that Garvey, he didn't understand why Garvey was of so much importance to people and to Black people. And we had a back and forth. You were critical of it. I'll let you pick up there and say anything else that you'd like to about what you saw, and we'll start there. But again, go ahead. Welcome.
Yeah, I'll start with, the reason why, the reason that motivated me to write that article. And as I explained in the article, I just, felt like Dr. Monteiro was being very dismissive of Garvey. And, it's one thing to be critical of Garvey, and I understand that position, but I feel like to take the position of arguing that you don't understand the appeal of Garvey at all, as I made the argument in the article, to me, if you don't understand Garvey's appeal on any level, essentially you're not really understanding the anti-colonial movement, because Garvey was such an integral part of that anti-colonial movement. And where your name came up, you did attempt to push back a little bit, because you mentioned, well, one of Garvey's appeals was, the idea of, racial pride and, African identity. That was certainly an important part of Garvey's legacy. But, where I brought your name up was I felt that attempt to push back really only scratched the surface of what I thought was significant about Marcus Garvey. That one aspect of what he was doing was certainly, racial pride and getting African people, particularly those in the United States and in the Caribbean, that had been disconnected from our African homeland. Part of that appeal was getting Africans in the diaspora to reconnect to Africa and to develop a sense of racial pride. But I think his appeal was much deeper than that. And as I explained in the article, Garvey, in addition to instilling racial pride, he was a very effective organizer. And his organization had branches spread out across the world. In Race First by Tony Martin, he points out that Garvey had branches in more than 40 different countries across the world. So, Garvey was a very effective organizer. And the other aspect of Garvey's appeal was that he also built real tangible institutions that were particularly important for African people, because, these were institutions that employed people, institutions that fed people, provided shelter, medical care. Garvey had trained nurses that also provided medical care as well. So in addition to the aspect of racial pride, Garvey had a movement, had an organization that was international and that was building institutions that really appealed to the needs of African people globally. So, as I said, it struck me to make the statement that you don't understand the appeal of Garvey on any level, when there was so much to that movement that attracted different people to Garvey and to what Garvey was doing. And as we'll get into to the discussion, the thing I haven't mentioned yet was just Garvey's impact on the global anti-colonial struggle, on the global Pan-African movement. And there's so many people who came after Garvey that were influenced by Garvey's vision, by Garvey's aims, by his organization. And what's especially interesting about the names that I can mention in terms of who were influenced by Garvey is that these individuals are across a very broad spectrum of ideologies when we talk about the Pan-African movement. So Garvey influenced Black nationalists like Elijah Muhammad. We could point to Garvey's influence on Malcolm X, but even going towards more the socialist Marxist tradition in the Pan-African movement, we could even point to Garvey's influences on Kwame Nkrumah, Walter Rodney. So you just see a very broad scope of people who were influenced by Garvey, ranging from people who I said were nationalists, people who were socialists, even people who could be considered neocolonialists like Jomo Kenyatta were influenced by Marcus Garvey. So Garvey just had a very profound impact on the global Pan-African movement in such a way that there were so many different movements, organizations, and leaders that came after him that were influenced by the work that he was doing. So as I said, when you make the statement that you don't understand the appeal of Marcus Garvey, what it comes across to me is you really don't understand the entire Pan-African movement that came after Garvey from the 1940s up until really present day.
Yeah, I mean, there were a number of things that Professor Monteiro said that struck me as wild in that conversation, but and that was one of them. And I agree with you, at least for the most part, that and that was one of the points that when I went back and watched the clip after reading your article, my biggest regret was that I didn't make the specific point that how can he be dismissed if he had built the biggest Black organization the world has ever seen, even if you don't like it, to dismiss it and not recognize the appeal of it is unfathomable to me. It doesn't make any sense. But I will say there is one thing, obviously, in my own selfishness that I want to defend against. So I just want to pull this up real quick, because there's one thing in my own defense that I think I would like to point out here. So when you said that, you said I don't think that you said that I don't think Dr. Ball properly explains this either. Garvey's appeal wasn't simply his message of race pride, but that Garvey backed up everything that he preached with a large international organization that operated institutions which employed, sheltered, and fed African people. My only real pushback on that is that you didn't mention the fact that I did defend Garvey on the issue of building a press. It wasn't just race pride, but I gave Garvey a big shout out for the independent press work that he did. So that's all. That was it. That was my little. I would have liked that part to be acknowledged. I didn't just lean on the race pride point, but yeah,
that was the first thing that you did. Mention.
No, it is. It is. It absolutely is. It absolutely is. But because that alone to me is the easiest thing to acknowledge that in terms of disagreeing with Monteiro's point, and specific to why I did make a note as to why I think, and then you can go on as much as you like, but I made a note as to why I don't think where my bias would be against the point you raised about what Garvey did do. So at the beginning here, let me just pull it up so everyone can see if they haven't already. You talk about what Garvey had left or provided that no one else did. And you said, quote, quoting Garvey, "I will tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock take you to 56 West 135th Street and show you between 70 and 80 Negro men and women employed. Then I will take you to the various enterprises in Harlem controlled by the UNIA, and I will there show you hundreds of Negro men and women employed in these enterprises at grocery stores, laundry, hotel, printing establishments, etc." And this is where my own bias and critique comes in, because as I've pointed out elsewhere, Tyler Perry could say the exact same thing. So making that point alone to me isn't moving. and which is would be one reason why just even unconsciously I would not have thought to reference something like that, even if I had remembered it or on some level, or why I would have consciously, if I had remembered it, I guess I should say, not chosen it as my point of defense for Garvey, because again, people like Tyler Perry can and do say the exact same thing. So, but anyway, go ahead with. Let me let you respond to any of that, and then.
Yes, so I have 2 points of response, and I'll start with the Tyler Perry first. Like, you're right that Tyler Perry, Jay-Z, there are many very wealthy black men that could make the similar argument, but I would argue the difference though would be the intention behind it. So obviously Tyler Perry is not fighting any he's not fighting neocolonialism on the continent or in the Caribbean. He's not trying to organize African people on a global scale. So that I do understand on a superficial level, Garvey can be compared to many of the black capitalists we see today. But I think the main difference is the intention behind what Garvey was doing, that Garvey was very deliberate about the fact that, he was organizing people towards, building an anti-colonial movement. And Garvey's ultimate vision was actually, the liberation of Africa. And as I mentioned before, that's why, Garvey's ideas had influenced so many, anti-colonial leaders that came after Garvey. Now, I don't think you can make the same argument for Tyler Perry. I can't really name any, activist or anti-colonial leader or radical scholar who I could point to and say that was an individual that watched Medea and came to revolutionary consciousness through a Tyler Perry movie. So I think that's a significant difference. But the other point I will make as well is that the reason why I mentioned that quote was in the context of the dispute between Garvey and Du Bois, that one of Garvey's defenses that he made of himself is that, compared to many of the people who were criticizing him, Garvey was actually building these things that were tangible in the sense of employing people, feeding people, and providing those services. And I think that's important as well, because very often when we talk about the whole Garvey versus Du Bois situation, I think it tends to kind of be reduced to the insults and those sort of things that they traded back and forth. But I think in that instance, Garvey was making a very serious point that even if you look beyond the insults and those type of things that they were trading back and forth, that when you compare what Garvey's organization was doing for ordinary African people compared to, and not just Du Bois, because in that quote Garvey was addressing his critics in general, that when you compare what he was doing when many of the people that were criticizing him really couldn't point to them building the sort of things to benefit African people that Garvey was doing. And again, I say that not to say that Garvey should be above critique or above criticism, but I just feel if we're really going to engage in a serious discussion about Du Bois and Garvey, that has to be something that would be put into consideration as well, that Garvey's organization was actually building institutions that are benefiting African people. And as Garvey himself pointed out, many of his critics were not doing the same thing.
Yeah, I just wanted to be clear. Yeah, it's I agree, but I just wrote a note here that what I needed to have added to my initial point was that the intention behind Garvey gets lost in the popular dissemination of Garvey, and he gets turned into a champion of black capitalism. Yep. That's what I think is. But you're right. So that's where I think in terms of my bias, why I wouldn't have gone to that point. Okay, so. Let me, if there's anything else specific to that conversation that you want to bring up or dig into, please do. Or if there's anything else from this particular article that you want to bring up to dig into, please do. Otherwise, I did want to turn specifically to your point that I tagged even for the thumbnail, that if you don't understand Garvey, you can't understand anti-colonial struggle. I do want to. I'm a hater. I love debate and critique, so I don't want to leave there if you're not ready to. But I do also not want to lose the more important point of talking about Garvey and what we do need to know about Garvey, as opposed to what Monteiro and I didn't get right in that conversation. But anything else? No, I mean I love that, but I mean, like I said, I don't want to just stay there.
Yeah, I understand. So I would just make a quick point, and I think this might even be relevant to the topic of Garvey and anti-colonialism, that Garvey and capitalism, it's a very complicated topic, mainly because Garvey himself was a self-professed capitalist. He spoke very highly of capitalism, and you're correct that very often Garvey gets used to promote black capitalism because of this idea that Garvey himself was a black capitalist. And why I think it's a complicated issue, because on one level Garvey was a black capitalist. He himself said he was a capitalist and spoke very highly of capitalism, but he was also very critical of capitalism. And what I've noticed is Garvey's critiques of capitalism typically don't get highlighted in the same way that his praise of capitalism gets highlighted. And one thing that Garvey said that it's very interesting, because this is not something that's quoted very often, but Garvey said that using his words, the Negro capitalist, he said we have to fight the Negro capitalist just as much as the white capitalist, because the Negro capitalist will sell his people into hell the same way that a white capitalist would. So that even though Garvey, as I said, was a self-professed capitalist, he did recognize certain exploitative aspects of the capitalist system, and he argued against those aspects. So I think adopting Garvey as a symbol of Black capitalism tends to create that problem that Garvey's critiques of capitalism tend to go neglected or unnoticed for various different reasons. I think critics of Garvey obviously use his alignment with capitalism as a way to criticize him without acknowledging Garvey's critiques of capitalism. And I think people who are Black capitalists will adopt Garvey's image to promote Black capitalism, again while ignoring Garvey's critiques of capitalism. So I just wanted to add that. I think that's an important point when we talk about Garvey's legacy, that he was a capitalist, but he did recognize that there were issues with capitalism that needed to be addressed. And to get to the point of anti-colonialism, many people tend not to notice about Garvey, but when he was deported and returned to Jamaica, he actually got involved in politics, and he established a political party, the People's Political Party, and one of the platforms of his party was very 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 pro workers in Jamaica. And so he's very supportive of workers unions, workers organizations, social security for workers. So that in addition to the critique of capitalism, there was also a very pro labor, very pro worker aspect of Garvey's ideology. And I think as I said, for different reasons, people who are tend to be critical of Garvey and people who use Garvey to promote Black capitalism, I think they tend to overlook that aspect of Garvey's ideology.
So when you when you raise the specific point about not being able to understand anti-colonial struggle without Garvey, is just say a little bit more about what you mean by that. Yeah.
Okay, so I'll actually get go into a very specific example. As you mentioned before, Guyanese. So being from Guyana, some of my biggest influences have actually been Guyanese, Pan-Africanists, such as UC Quayana, such as Walter Rodney. Now, starting with UC Quayana, he was very instrumental in the anti-colonial struggle in Guyana against the British colonial powers. And UC, when he was talking about his upbringing and his early development into Pan-African consciousness, he mentioned that he recalled as a child when Garvey had visited Guyana, and people were very excited and they were singing songs about Garvey. So that was his early introduction to the aspect of Garveyism that you're talking about, the race pride, that he just remembered. The Black adults at the time were very proud of Garvey. He recalled at the time there was a lot of poetry singing praises to Africa, poetry about the importance of Black identity. So his early influence and experience of Black consciousness came during that period when Garvey had visited Guyana, and the Garvey movement was still very active in the Caribbean. Now, he mentions as he grows into adulthood and he starts organizing with people in Guyana on the basis of developing political organizations, anti-colonial organizations, Pan-African organizations, he mentions that many of the people that he was encountering were Garveyites, people who were influenced by Garvey. I mentioned Walter Rodney. When we look at Walter Rodney's writings in his book, The Groundings with My Brothers, he mentions that, in his opinion, Garvey was the greatest spokesman of Black consciousness that had ever been produced. So, even just, for my, even just looking at it from like a Guyanese context, in terms of looking at the anti-colonial struggle in Guyana, looking at the Pan-African struggle in Guyana, that you really can't talk about the Pan-African or the anti-colonial struggle in Guyana without acknowledging that many of the prominent leaders in that movement were influenced by Garvey. And another name here that I can mention, although there are some contradictions with with this man Forbes Burnham, because even though he was a Pan-Africanist and an anti-colonialist, he was also put in power in Guyana by the CIA, and as I said, there were certain contradictions of Burnham's ideology and the circumstances in which he was put into power. But even Forbes Burnham, Guyana's first prime minister, he too was influenced by Garvey, to the point that to this day the political flag for Burnham's party, the People's National Congress, is the RBG Garvey flag. So, and that's why I made the point before that, it's not just the anti-colonial, activists that were influenced by Garvey, but even certain figures that could be seen as neo-colonialists. And, I would make the argument that, to some extent, Burnham was a neo-colonialist. Even he was influenced by Garvey. So, the point I'm making here is just that one particular country, Guyana, to truly understand the ideological development of the anti-colonial and the Pan-African movement in just that one country, you really have to understand Garvey's influence on that movement, his influence on many of the leading figures of that time period. And that's just one country. Another example I could give is the United States, where I think Garvey's influence is perhaps more noticeable because not only was the United States the headquarters of his movement for a period of time, the United States is the nation where Garvey had his largest following. But after Garvey was deported, as I mentioned, the Nation of Islam came to prominence, and Elijah Muhammad, according to some reports, was himself a follower of Garvey and had belonged to Garvey's organization. Malcolm X, he mentions in his autobiography, his parents were Garveyites, and some of his earliest memories were going to Garveyite meetings with his father. Rosa Parks, recalled that her grandfather was a Garveyite. So even in the United
And I
States,
thought she was herself a member of the UNIA. Am I wrong on that?
I haven't come across anything.
Okay, maybe I'm wrong on that. Okay,
but I know she did mention that her grandfather was. So even in the United States, we could see that many of the activists, many of the figures that became very prominent in the 50s, 60s, and even 70s were influenced by Marcus Garvey. So those are just two examples to show that Garvey's impact was such that he influenced the generations of activists that came after him. And I would make the argument that you really cannot properly understand a Walter Rodney or a Yusuf Kwana in the Guyanese context, or you can't properly understand Malcolm X in the United States, in the American context, without understanding Garvey and that influence. And Malcolm X, I think a lot of people tend to not be aware of this or to overlook this, but when he left the Nation of Islam and created his new organization, the Organization of Afro-American Unity, he specifically said that he was continuing the work of Garvey because as you recall, Malcolm was going to the African continent and meeting with African leaders, and Malcolm had recognized that Garvey was trying to build that large international Pan-African movement, and he felt he was continuing Garvey's work by going to the continent and building that organization on the continent. So with Malcolm, there was a very conscious and deliberate connection with Garvey. And so far I haven't even really spoken to Garvey's impact on the anti-colonial struggles on the African continent. So even just looking at two particular countries, you can see that Garvey had a very profound influence on the anti-colonial struggle in Ghana and on the civil rights and Black Power movement in the United States. So as I said, given the type of impact that Garvey had, it's very difficult to fully grasp how these movements developed without connecting it to the impact and the influence that Garvey had.
By the way, that was the other note of self-defense that I had meant in this, that Garvey wasn't supposed to be the topic of our discussion with Monteiro, and I wasn't ready for I had I wasn't ready for that kind of a shocking dismissal. So but like I said, I'm glad that it led to this. So I'm good.
And in your defense, I could tell when you were trying to come up with a response, I could tell it was very on the spot in the moment, and you were trying to come up.
And it was like, wow, man, I'm not used to that. Again, I'm used to a Du Boisian saying I don't like Garvey for this, that. I would not have been ready for someone to say, I don't even understand why Black people like him. That part was, I wasn't ready for that. So, yeah, anyway. So there's a couple other things I did want to ask you about. I don't know how much time you have, or we didn't really spend too much time preparing this, but, or if there's more on Garvey. Well, and I don't know how much you want to get into with Garvey, and so if there's more, I'm happy to do that. I don't, I don't have any particular issues that I wanted to challenge or raise. I just wanted to give you room to lay this out. But one of them, and I made a note just now because I forgot. One of the issues is that I forgot that it was you who was initially in a Twitter back and forth with Dr. Greg Carr when I jumped in, and then he and I went into our thing. And that was around the issue. That was the part about the elections and not wanting to support, right? So. And your argument, so I did want to bring that back up now that it came into my mind. Like, do you remember that exchange you were having with him? And
Vaguely, because it was around the election, but and again, it's very difficult to have these Twitter exchanges because limited character space. I think it leaves room for a lot of miscommunication. But the point I was making is that, and I believe it was Angela Davis. Angela Davis perhaps gave a comment, endorsing Joe Biden. So the point I was making is that her position is essentially voting for the lesser of two evils, and my position on that is I'm not necessarily opposed to that. Someone who takes a position that I'm going to vote, for the Democrats because I view them as being the lesser of two evils. I don't necessarily have an issue with that, but I just think in terms of the type of discourse that we're having on Twitter, I feel like just be honest that that's your position. Don't try to make it more than what it is. And the exchanges I had with Dr. Carr at the time was around the fact that when you look at the political history of the United States, typically Black people don't make progress by voting for either political party. Progress is usually made by mobilization, by having social movements such as the civil rights movement. Now I understand his position is a little bit different. As I found out from those exchanges, he seems to have more faith in the political process than I do. But my argument was that if you are going to vote lesser of two evils, just be honest about the fact that that is what you're doing, that you're not necessarily voting white supremacy out of power, you're not voting capitalism out of power, you're just voting for the lesser of two evils.
Yeah, that sounds about right. And it was the way he was engaging you that I think more than anything made me want to jump in. And I was
and I'll say here, I thought it was very condescending. And then some other people were jumping in, and the problem I had with that particular conversation is that where I live in Florida, I was actually part of the effort to mobilize and to get nonviolent offenders, people who had been convicted for drug offenses, to get their voting rights restored. So I felt like Dr. Carr and others were trying to paint me in a position where I'm completely against voting, I'm completely against political engagement, and it was almost a position where I felt like I've probably done more to help people gain the right to vote than some of the people who criticizing me for the position I took. So as I said, I'm not against voting, not against people taking the position of voting for the lesser of two evils. I just feel that you need to be honest about the type of conversations that are being had. But that was that was a surprise to me because
that was the issue. You're right. It wasn't even it's very similar to my critique about what is said about Black businesses or anything else, that people will make the claim that when they're pushed, they'll make the claim, oh, I'm just doing this as a survival program. I know we got to do something later, but no, that's not really what you're doing. You're saying this is the end of your political argument. Like, this is your culmination this is where you've concluded we need to be, and just admit it and let's move on, or make plain the tactic that you're using this as. And I don't see that either. Otherwise, you're just telling us to vote for the lesser of two evils, and then when we challenge you, you say, oh, no, I know it's just in the interim, but what else are you going? Anyway, it was just such a disingenuous but anyway, I wanted to acknowledge that. The other thing I wanted to raise with you is that, and I just noticed when I was reviewing your Medium page, that you're still engaging, apparently, or covering or paying attention to the reverse hashtaggers, as I've come to call them. And I honestly, the block and mute option it does work, and you can almost create a false universe for yourself online. So I haven't been paying much attention. But as you said in the piece, they're still at it. So I did want to ask you, in sort of in relationship to this discussion of Garvey's role in terms of pan-Africanism, and I didn't mean to ask you about this. Was he pan-Africanist or African nationalist debate? But before we come back, we can end with something more substantive. One of the backlashes against Garvey and is this reverse hashtag thing that is like a full a Black America only, and the United States is our salvation. Now, obviously, admitting that you're from Guyana, you're disqualified. You've completely ruined your whole what credibility on this issue. But my first real question is, why are you still paying attention to them? Why do you think it's necessary?
Well, I'll start with the Ghana part, because that's something that I do find sort of ironic with these arguments, that the same people will say, oh, you're Guyanese, so you can't speak on Black American issues, but these are the same people that will make claims that Garvey had to leave Jamaica because he wasn't supported in the Caribbean. And my pushback against that was, but suddenly you as a Black American now want to comment on Caribbean politics and Caribbean history. That should be, my area. Leave that to me. Don't speak on Garvey in the Caribbean if that's the case. But it's interesting. The reason why I do actually continue to pay attention to them, I write articles, because I realized the first time around writing articles that in addition to pushing back against some of the claims they're making, people who read articles actually learn. I remember someone came to me and said she didn't know that Malcolm's mom was from Grenada. So what I realized that when I write articles pushing back against the disinformation and the lies that I'm seeing coming from them, it also helps to educate other people on different aspects of our history, different aspects of the Pan-African struggle that people otherwise wouldn't have known about. And over the course of writing these articles, I think people who've read those articles really have gained more insight into just how interconnected our histories are, how international the Pan-African movement really is. So some of the information that I brought out is as I mentioned, Marcus Garvey having a mother who is Grenadian, from Grenada. A lot of people aren't aware of that. Mentioning Kwame Ture, Stokely Carmichael, and how close his connection was to Martin Luther King, because the same people you're referring to, the reverse hashtag, they tried to frame it as, well, because he's from Trinidad, there was some kind of tension or competition between Kwame Ture and Dr. King. And my articles really delve into the relationship and point out that even though there were ideological disagreements, there was a very strong sense of respect between the two men, to the point where Kwame Ture always spoke about Martin Luther King's influence on him as an activist, and somewhat
all the way to the end, all the way till his end. Yeah.
And he always spoke about King's integrity, and he spoke very favorably of King. But the irony is, the biggest disagreement that the two of them had was on the question of violence and nonviolence. And even then, Kwame Ture credited King with his position on violence, because he said, Dr. King trained and encouraged Black people to face the enemy nonviolently. So Kwame Ture said, given that King had trained me to face the enemy nonviolently, it took nothing to pick up a gun to go fight the enemy. So he even credited King with his position on violence, saying that King's nonviolence helped to prepare him for violence. So that's why I continue to respond, because they raise certain things, and to me, when I see that, I see it as an opportunity to educate people on these connections, to educate people on these relationships. One that I did recently was on the very topic of Garvey, in the Caribbean. That's why I mentioned it, because one of the claims is Garvey had to leave Jamaica because he was rejected in Jamaica. The point that I make, and that also leads to a broader claim that in the Caribbean, Caribbean people never accepted Pan-Africanism, which is why Garvey had to come to America to build the Pan-African movement. And the argument that I make is, when you look at the history of the Caribbean, and I understand that in the United States, we don't really get Caribbean history, very much in school. To be honest, in the Caribbean, we don't really get very much Caribbean history. But when you look at the history of the Caribbean, a lot of prominent Pan-African leaders came out of the Caribbean, and I'm not even talking about the Garvey period. Even before Garvey, we could point to people like Henry Sylvester Williams, who actually organized the first Pan-African conference in 1900. Is where we get the term Pan-African from. And even Garvey's mentor was a man named Joseph Robert Love, who had organized the Pan-African Association in Jamaica. So again, that's why I like to respond to certain claims, because that gives me now an opportunity to really elaborate on and educate people on the history of the Pan-African movement in the Caribbean, even before Garvey organized his movement. So to answer the question, I think there is still some value in responding to those claims, in as much as the responses might educate people. But otherwise, I prefer. I do understand that going back and forth can become counterproductive and it becomes a waste of time. So I'm very selective.
No, but I like what you said, and I like your point. I mean, I like that method of response. It makes sense. And if right, because even if there are those who will just refuse the argument and refuse to read and engage, you're still providing the rest of us something to build from. So that, yeah, right on. Dang, I just lost. I got it. That's why I got to write everything down, because I just lost my train of thought again.
Was it related to Garvey or
yeah, definitely related to Garvey. And well, let me just come back to the question I did write down, and just the what for me is the more recent bubbling, it feels like, of the argument around Garvey not being a pan-Africanist and being an African nationalist, and this distinction that to me seems, I'm not perfectly versed in it, but seems to be more about distinguishing him from Du Bois than the ideas themselves per se. But have you followed this? Do you have a position on this, or
Yeah, I'm very
yeah.
very familiar with that. And I know the first time that actually came to my attention was the Uhuru movement, led by Mali Yeshitela. That was the first time I became aware of that argument that Garvey really wasn't a Pan-Africanist. And as you pointed out, the reason for that was to separate Garvey from Du Bois, but also to separate African internationalism and that ideology and that movement from the broader Pan-African movement. And I did write a Medium article about that. And the argument I made is that on some level, I do understand the African internationalist position, because their position is Pan-Africanism is too broad of a concept or too broad of an ideology. And the reality is that is true to some extent. And you recall earlier I mentioned that Garvey had even influenced people who could be considered neo-colonialist. So that within the Pan-African movement, we do have very very revolutionary Pan-Africanists, anti-colonial Pan-Africanists, and unfortunately, we've had neo-colonialists who are Pan-Africanists. And I would make the argument that the African Union is a great representation of Pan-Africanism in a neo-colonial form. So that's the African internationalist position, to separate Garvey from Du Bois and to separate Garvey from manifestations of Pan-Africanism that are neo-colonial in nature. But the broader argument about whether or not Garvey is a Pan-Africanist, to me, it's just an argument over labels rather than ideas, because the reality is that when Garvey organized his movement, Pan-Africanism still wasn't in common usage. As I mentioned, Pan-Africanism really became more common, or came into popular usage in 1900 with Henry Sylvester Williams's Pan-African Conference. But even after that conference, people who had been engaged in international organizing weren't necessarily calling themselves Pan-Africanists, or weren't calling what they were doing Pan-Africanism, because that was more so associated with Williams's conference, and it was more so associated with W.E.B. Du Bois's Pan-African congresses. So Garvey didn't call himself a Pan-Africanist, but I would make the argument that if you look at Pan-Africanism as a concept, as a concept that represents the international connections among African people, certainly Garvey was a Pan-Africanist in the sense that he believed in uniting African people internationally. But also I've made the argument that even just tracing Garvey's development, I mentioned before, one of his mentors was Joseph Robert Love, who had organized the Pan-African Association in Jamaica. So even when we look at the development of the Pan-African movement, and we trace the development of the Pan-African movement from Henry Sylvester Williams to Robert Love in Jamaica, Garvey still does come out of that Pan-African tradition that Williams and Love established. So even though Garvey didn't call himself a Pan-Africanism, he still came out of the Pan-African tradition, and more or less what he was advocating for was a form of Pan-Africanism. And to get back to the Garvey versus Du Bois issue a little bit, that is actually one area that they both agreed on. There weren't no differences between the two of them in terms of the importance to Africa on the Black American struggle. Now Garvey, Du Bois didn't necessarily agree with Garvey's position of getting ships and sending Black Americans to Africa to develop Africa, but ironically that's where Du Bois himself ended up dying and where he's buried. And actually when I visited Ghana, I got to visit Du Bois's final resting place. But so in terms of the ideological conflict between Garvey and Du Bois, that is one thing that they had in common. And that even though Garvey didn't call himself a Pan-Africanist in the way that Du Bois called himself a Pan-Africanist, Garvey still shared Du Bois's understanding that international African unity is important, and that the anti-colonial struggle in Africa is connected to the struggle of Black people in the United States.
So that it just occurred to me, and I just frustrated myself again now thinking about it. That the other thing that I would normally have thought to say in the defense of Garvey is that Hoover's first mission was to get rid of him.
Yep.
That even before there was an FBI or what would emerge into a COINTELPRO that would, I don't know, in some variation, even go after Du Bois in terms of blocking this is pre-COINTELPRO, of course, but blocking his travel and career and et cetera and so forth. Uh, um, so kind of like anybody, maybe not anybody, but a lot of people who would be targeted by Hoover for that kind of work deserve a little bit of a, like a little bit of a,
Yeah.
what I mean? Yeah. Anyway, go ahead.
That's a good point, and that's why the Du Bois versus Garvey thing. I think oftentimes when we approach that conversation, we tend to take sides, and I understand that there are people who might have a bias towards Du Bois, ideologically might lean towards Du Bois, or ideologically might lean towards Garvey. And I think it's the point that you made is important, that at the end of the day, both of them were targeted by the same power structure. And it's not just those two. I mean, same thing when we look at Malcolm X versus Martin Luther King, same situation. They were both targeted by.
Well, all of them. When we were talking with now the late Jeffrey Perry, right? Jeffrey Perry about his work on Hubert Henry Harrison,
Yeah.
and I'm going back and I'm reading all of the beef between Du Bois and Garvey and Cyril Briggs and Garvey and all the trash they were talking about each other. All of them were being targeted, and all of them got, I mean, so it's like, it's like, yeah. Anyway, by the way, if anybody in the chat has any comments or questions, please start to recycle them to the top. Having mentioned him, where have you written also on Harrison? Like, where is he in all of this for you? Now that his name just came up.
I have not written very much about him, but he certainly is a very important figure during this time period, and he was actually instrumental in Garvey's initial building of his organization. Now the two men fell out, and unfortunately, it was often the case, especially during this period of time, where a lot of these men, when they fell out, it wasn't even over ideological differences necessarily, because Harrison was also a pan-Africanist as well. I haven't looked into this myself, but I've seen some people even argue that race first, which is that the term that we associate with Garvey, actually came from Harrison, and Garvey got it from him. So I haven't written on him.
I want to say that when those 2 glorious years at the Africana Studies and Research Center, then under the original director, Dr. James Turner, that I read a bunch of Harrison, and I think didn't he actually write something that's even said race first in the I got it, man. Maybe somebody in the chat will remember, but I think that is a good point. I mean, he was particularly initially. I mean, that was or maybe not initially, but after his efforts to build with white labor. I mean, that's where he goes. He's like, we got it's. I think that right. I have that right. He goes blatantly race first.
Yeah.
Without ever ignoring the class element. So he's a complicated nuance, nuance thing, hold up. I got to be quicker with it. That's why I got to get, hold up.
Message.
There it is. Nuance. Anyway, I was trying to look real quick for something else that I did mean to ask you about. But anyway, let me let you respond or add on to any of that if there was something you wanted to.
Yeah, so the point I was going to make is just, the conflict between Garvey and Harrison, I think, also was unfortunate because it really just came down to an ego conflict that ideologically there wasn't really that serious of a difference. Harrison just felt like Garvey had been too egotistical, so that was the basis of their falling out. And to some extent, that was also the issue with Du Bois and Garvey, that much of what Du Bois took issue with Garvey was just Garvey's approach and his mannerisms and that sort of thing. So that's the unfortunate part too. A lot of these disagreements really just came down to personal issues that these leaders couldn't work beyond. And the final point I'll make here is that Harrison, that was a very real struggle that a lot of Black socialists at the time had to deal with. That the conflict between class and race, because it was almost a situation where you couldn't really enter white, socialist spaces, white communist spaces. George Padmore ran into the same problem, and he broke from the Communist Party. And ironically, Padmore went from being extremely critical of Garvey to actually praising Garvey when he broke with the Communist Party and became a Pan-Africanist. But that also was a very serious challenge as well, that a lot of Black socialists did have to deal with racism from white socialists.
And I think from the Western states' power, the Francis Stoner Saunders book argues that break from Padmore in favor of Garvey over communism made him safer from their perspective.
Yeah.
That they want anybody who just as long as you moved away from the big C, they were like, I don't even care anymore. Not that was sensible, but it was interesting.
Yeah.
One thing that I definitely wanted to ask you about, but didn't prepare for, admittedly, and I can't find it in one of these, and I keep. So I mentioned this before, but in trying to catch up with, I know in our conversation with one of them with Sister Coco about Rodney, he says something that in terms of this soda reverse hashtag thing, I forgot to ask you about. This was the point, by the way, that I lost. Rodney says something about, and I don't know if you are familiar with this, but he says something about Black Americans. He talks about the three. He says continental Africans, damn it, have one area of expertise and failure.
Yeah.
People in the Caribbean have one area of expertise and failure. People in the United States or the North America have the United States have an area of expertise and failure, and one of them was centered around this inability to see Blackness beyond the United States. Does this ring a bell for you in terms of your what you've come up? And I don't want to be disrespectful, but if I appear off camera, I'm hearing you. I'm just right here looking at my bookshelf, so I just want to. I don't want to, but. Does that ring a bell for you? And if so, what are your thoughts on that? And how could that be interpreted or misinterpreted today?
So that particular statement doesn't ring a bell, but it does strike me as being similar to other remarks that I've read by Walter Rodney, and that was, as a Pan-Africanist, that was something that he was trying to deal with. The concept of Blackness across different societies and class as well. Rodney being a Marxist. So, in the American context, that was something that he had pointed out, that he felt, given the nature of the racist system in the United States, given Jim Crow and segregation and that sort of thing, that he felt that Black Americans had a tendency to look at situations on the African continent and to look at situations in the Caribbean on the basis of race, more so than looking at the class element. And that became a particular issue in Ghana, where Walter Rodney was pointing out that many Black Americans had been going to Ghana and commenting favorably on the stuff that Forbes Burnham was doing. As you recall, I mentioned Burnham earlier. And Rodney's position was that they were looking at it solely on the race aspect, that they were going to Ghana and seeing a country that was run by a Black prime minister, and the government are made up of Black people. So they felt that at the particular time where Black people in the United States were calling for Black power, they felt that the government in Ghana was a manifestation or a representation of Black power. So, Walter Rodney had made the argument that really it was neocolonialism, that even though it was a Black government and a Black prime minister, that the policies that were being put in place were policies that were detrimental to the interest of the Black masses in Ghana, and that the Black government in Ghana really did not represent the interest of the masses. So, that's something he struggles with when he's dealing with Black Americans, that Black Americans tend to look at things through a racial aspect. But now what's interesting with Walter Rodney, as he's organizing on the African continent, is the reverse situation, where he almost feels like people on the African continent become too dismissive of the concept of race. And that's something that when he's in Tanzania actually becomes a debate that he has with some of his colleagues in Tanzania, where they almost feel like Walter Rodney is trying to take the North American concept of race and bring that into Africa. And Walter Rodney's position is, when we're talking about Pan-Africanism is a racial concept. We're talking about the unity of African people. And Walter Rodney asked the question of, how could you have Pan-Africanism on a continent that denies the existence of race when it is a racial concept? So that is something that is interesting about Walter Rodney as a Pan-Africanist who's worked, in different areas of the African world, that he's had to adjust and comment on the different perceptions of Blackness depending on where he is. So as I said, in the United States, the perception is that the focus is more so on race, and on the African continent there was more of a focus on class. And Walter Rodney was always trying to find the bridge between the two positions.
Yeah, I definitely remember that part about the race issue. I mean, to be honest, I think we still have that all of these problems
Yep.
that a lot of times well, in my anecdotal unscientific experience with continental Africans, too much of it is the problem with Black America is an inability to take advantage of what is a possibility
Yep.
here, and the problem in Africa is the fraudulence of the poor leadership. And when Black people here say, race is more of an issue, and then you realize it I'm not doing a good. I agree with what you're saying. Let me just leave it there. I'll just. I couldn't find the book yet. I gotta. I will. So this is what I would like to do. I would like to publicly and formally invite you to make more routine appearances on this program and on this platform. I think, given all that you write and have to say, it would be great if you would discuss more of it with us on a regular basis. So let's talk more about how you might want to do that,
Yep.
including maybe even developing your own show if you're interested in that kind of thing. I don't know if that's a thing for you, but I think it would be great if we could work with you on that.
Okay.
But because I would like to talk more with you and others about Rodney and just be a little more prepared for that than I clearly am right now. So
Yeah, I wasn't expecting to talk about Rodney either. I came here thinking we were going to talk
no, I
about.
know. Yeah, exactly. And you, but there's I mean, there's a lot I would want to hear from you on. I do know over the years you've written a lot about, I mean, a lot of different things involving various African countries. You were just even covering, I think, recently the what's going on in Nigeria.
Yeah.
We're definitely wanting more coverage of that. I know I'm on my little show on the platform in general. I think so I just would want to invite that. Just quickly, a couple of is this in fact true? The RBG flag was a knockoff of Harrison's black, brown, and tan flag, which depicted the color of Black people around the globe.
Yeah.
I
See, I've
I
never
don't
heard
remember
that
that.
before. But yeah,
Yeah, I'd have to check. Yeah, I'd have to double check.
never heard that
It,
before.
if you massive performance media, if there's any links or references, maybe I just missed it, forgot it. I don't know. How much do you think the personal differences between Garvey, Du Bois, Harrison, Briggs, and A. Philip Randolph impacted their politics? I always wondered how their political projects were impacted. My short answer is just kind of like what I was saying after looking again last year or whatever at Perry's work. I suspect that people were a lot less mature than we give them credit for looking back. I think a lot of them would have been just as petty today on YouTube if they had access to it as we are today. And I think, and the older I get, the more clear it is to me. There's a lot of personal ego, bias, people, baggage we're all bringing into this work that negatively impacts our I'll speak for myself, my own ability to engage properly. So I have no doubt that as great as these people were, I mean, anyway, you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah. So what I will say about that is that and you're right. These issues that we see, people going back and forth on social media, it's not new. We've always had a level of pettiness and immaturity within the community. But I think what's different now is, and I made that point before, that when we talk about Garvey's organization was actually building things. There were tangible things that we could point to with Garvey. To some extent Du Bois as well. That even though Du Bois wasn't necessarily as great an organizer as Garvey was, that he was still doing concrete political work, particularly around anti-lynching. A lot of people aren't aware that when the United States had occupied Haiti, Du Bois was part of that effort, condemning the American occupation of Haiti. That Du Bois was doing real concrete political work. He was also involved in organizations. And the problem that I noticed today is that a lot of the people on YouTube who are engaged in these back and forths don't really have the same level of organization, don't really have the same level of political activity, so that it just simply becomes a personality contest, and that's all it is. It's just back and forth between two people who don't like each other on a personal level, whereas Du Bois and Garvey and some of those leaders at the time, that even though a lot of the conflicts between them were very personal, there was very tangible, substantial things that they were doing that we could still point to and take from. And I just feel like in this day and age of social media, it almost feels like a bunch of people who really engage in the back and forth because that's all they have. The only reason why people even pay attention to them, it almost feels as if people pay attention because they like the conflicts and they like the drama, so they keep tuning into these YouTube channels, but there's no serious political or organizational work behind it. So to me, that's what I see as being the difference between those conflicts then and many of the conflicts we see playing out on social media now.
Yeah, right on. I agree with that. And to sound of St. Elsewhere's point, Jeffrey Perry does make the point. I'm looking it up now. He does. He talks about, well, on one point, it seems, if I'm reading too quickly and I'm trying to not be disrespectful by not paying attention, so I may be wrong here, but I want to say that they're saying that Perry is making we'll have to come back. I'll have to come back to this, but I think he's making the point that Garvey inspired the tricolor flag of the Irish independence movement, or is he saying vice versa? Now I can't remember. I'm not catching it. But there was a tricolor flag that Harrison also developed. I just don't see the specific. It's in here, but it's in here. I'm just not getting the exact spot exactly right. But yeah, there does seem to be. So yeah, I mean, I just have to dig back into it. Let's see, on Garvey's tricolor flag. Garvey. There is some relationship between apparently Sinn Féin. I never know if I'm saying that properly. The Irish independence movement and their flag. Anyway. So very interesting, very interesting. Have to come back to that for sure. Thank you for that. Sounds of St. Elsewhere. Any other comments or questions real quick? Otherwise, I will, give you any chance to say anything you wanted to say, and we can, wrap up for now, and hopefully, start having you back on more often. But is there anything else you would want us to get to? I don't want to rush you. I don't have anything else prepared to be honest. So I didn't want to just.
That's fine. I mean, I guess I could, because as I said before, the examples I gave of Garvey and his impact was mainly just focusing on Guyana and the United States. So I probably could expand a little bit on Garvey's international.
Sure. Yeah, let's do that.
Impact, and starting with Jamaica, where Garvey's from, and obviously the Rastafarian movement, which starts in Jamaica, was heavily influenced by Garvey to the point where I've written about this in one of my books. That I find it interesting that Leonard Howell was actually the first Rasta. He was, the first man that really promoted this idea that Haile Selassie was a divine figure. But somehow Garvey is actually more influential in the Rastafarian movement than even the man who founded the religious movement. So, that shows the type of impact that Garvey had. And, I think what's very important too to understand about, the Rastafarian movement is that, very often we think of it, we just associate with reggae music, and we think, Bob Marley, Peter Tosh, and those sort of artists. And I think we often overlook that for a period of time, it was actually a very revolutionary anti-colonial movement to the point where the revolution in Grenada that brought Maurice Bishop to power, Rastas were actually involved in that revolution, and they helped overthrow Eric Gary's government, so that Rastas were actually a very revolutionary movement in the Caribbean during one period of time. And that is yet another example of Garvey influencing an anti-colonial movement. So again, I go back to my point that how do you really understand the revolutionary movement that the Rastafarian movement was? How do you understand Bob Marley and the type of things that Bob Marley was singing about in terms of African unity and Bob Marley's support for anti-colonial struggles in Africa? How do you understand that without understanding Garvey's impact and his influence on those movements? So that's one example. And even to dig deeper in Grenada with Maurice Bishop, that I don't know how many people are aware of this, but when Bishop was the prime minister in Grenada during that revolutionary period, they celebrated Marcus Garvey Day. There was a whole day dedicated to Garvey and Garvey's anti-colonial vision. So that goes back to the point that there's just so many great Pan-African leaders, great anti-colonial revolutionary leaders that on so many levels were influenced by Marcus Garvey. And same thing on the continent. Kwame Nkrumah mentioned that of all the literature that he read, Marcus Garvey's writings had the biggest influence on him. In Kenya, when we think of the anti-colonial movement in Kenya, I think the Mau Mau probably are the more popular. But before the Mau Mau, there was actually a movement led by a man named Harry Tuku, and Tuku was an anti-colonial activist in Kenya, and he was in communication with Garvey. He'd written a letter to Garvey, and when the British colonial government arrested Tuku and shot at his supporters, Garvey actually sent a telegram to the British government denouncing their actions in Kenya, so that we see even on the African continent, many of these anti-colonial leaders are not only being influenced by Garvey, but the first generation of anti-colonial movement leaders before Nkrumah's generation, before the Mau Mau generation, that first generation of nationalist leaders on the continent were leaders who were actually in contact with Marcus Garvey. So that even before we get to Kwame Nkrumah's generation, when we look at the history of the nationalist movement in the Gold Coast, Joseph Casely Hayford was arguably the leading figure in that anti-colonial nationalist movement, and he was also in close communication with Garvey, and he was very supportive of Garvey's movement. So even moving away from the diaspora, moving away from the United States and the Caribbean, that even when we look on the African continent, we once again see Garvey's impact. And what's very profound about Garvey's impact on the continent is that a typical criticism that I've seen of Garvey is that he never actually just went to the continent. That he spoke about back to Africa and liberating Africa, and he never went to the continent himself. But the thing is, even though he never gone to the continent, his political impact was still very profound on the continent, more so than any other anti-colonial leader who was on the continent at that particular period of time.
Again, my default is usually always, well, what would someone have done had the most powerful state in the world not been trying to intervene in their behavior? So I don't know, maybe if Garvey hadn't been so interrupted, he would have, who knows what would have happened.
Yeah.
So let's not, by the way, first of all, everybody, let's get it clear. Dr. Monique Badesi has been on this platform before, and the only reason she's not here more often is because she is too busy or interested in other forms of work. Don't ever think that my Africana Studies and Research Center comrades, specifically under the tutelage of its founding director, Dr. James Turner, the late great Dr. Badesi, don't think you telling me about, anyway. Her book is fantastic, her work is fantastic, and her previous interview on this platform is fantastic. So make sure you go find it. I'll make sure that put it in the show description. And as she knows, anytime she wants to come through, she's welcome, So anyway, but definitely a great book to read, Ja Kingdom. And anyway, so one question did come through. I have not seen this. Your thoughts on Jacobin's Prescott article claiming Garvey was a conservative who abandoned radicalism, believed in elitist leadership, advocated colonial rule, and created civilized nations. I have to admit, my own bias, I've not seen it, and this is not scientific, it's not scholarly, my response here, but it's the fact that it was in Jacobin suggests to me that it is going to be a problem. So they're not interested in race first analysis. They're very clear on that, and I get it. But you can have a class first approach. You can be even maybe right in a class first analysis, but your argument against why people would adopt a race first perspective should be sound and respectful of the communities in question. And I think a lot of what Jacobin produces, whether it's in terms of Afro-pessimism, which we dealt with directly, or here clearly with Garvey, anything that's race first is going to be treated with the utmost disrespect. And I'm not here for that. So I just think that there are sound arguments that people can make if they need to make them against Garvey or against whatever else, that don't need to descend into madness. But again, I did not read this. I don't even know which Prescott is being discussed here. Have you seen it? Do you know what's being discussed?
Yeah,
okay.
I wasn't even aware of an article like that. But when I saw the comments, something that did pop into my head, the whole idea that Garvey abandoned radicalism, I'm kind of interested in what was the particular argument around that, because obviously in the United States,
class analysis, that's what it would mean from the Jacobins' perspective.
But when I said, okay, so because when I said abandon them, like, does it mean at some point they felt like Garvey switched, his political positions and became less radical of a figure? That's how I took that. But, as I said, I haven't read. I'm not even aware of that. Don't read it.
Okay. Well, I wasn't planning to, but just in case you or anyone else had, they were the previous video that I just did about Bernie Sanders, the Jacobin crew, when I was first introduced to them, it was through their defense of Bernie and what I thought at the time was a very poor argument against mine or anyone else's critique about why we should. And then, so the more I paid attention to them and they became more and more prominent in left spaces as a publication, it's just very clear. So I'm sure they've done some good work there that would defend themselves, but the first thing I thought of is this is why CLR James wrote Black Jacobins. That just a reminder to the rest of the world that there are these African freedom fighters that have their own, contributions, if not fully formed worldviews and perspectives. That here we are with Jacobin magazine seeming to do the same thing. Anyway, whatever. But okay, let's listen again. If there's anything else you want to, again, I'm not meaning to rush you. I don't see any other questions, and I've run out of my own. But other than to once again, I will follow up with you privately. But I do think this needs to be the first of many appearances on this platform for you. And I appreciate you being critical of us in a respectful and I think appropriate way. And I love that, and I'm happy to have you come on to talk more about that. And any other time you feel like I or we fall short, you could develop a whole running the shortcomings of BPM blog, and we can build from that. That could be your segment, whatever. Anyway, I think that'd be great. But anyway, anything else you want to make sure we cover, or you want to alert us to in terms of your work or something coming up?
Yeah, and I would be very happy to come back on. So I definitely would take you up on that invitation. But it's not related to Garvey, but it is something that I'd actually considered writing a separate article about. But I'll address a little bit here. That when I published my article, I received a comment on Facebook actually where someone was sort of defending Du Bois because they felt like I was being too dismissive of Du Bois. So the same thing that I was criticizing happening to Garvey. Someone was trying to check to make sure that I'm not doing that with Du Bois. And I made the argument in the comment, and I'll make it here, that when I made the point that Du Bois wasn't the organizer that Garvey was, to me that's a factual statement. And I even mentioned in the article I didn't intend it to be a criticism of Du Bois. I just feel like the reality is that Garvey was a much better organizer, a mobilizer than Du Bois was. But the point I made in the comment, and the point I want to make here, is that that's not intended as an attack on Du Bois. And actually, Du Bois is someone I have a lot of admiration for, a great deal of respect for. And from a scholarly level, Du Bois has been a very profound influence on me. Particularly as a Pan-African scholar. When I read his book on the Negro, and I was still in college at the time when I first read that book. That book was really a snapshot of the entire history of African people, from the Nile Valley civilizations up until the slave trade and the emergence of different African, different experiences of African people throughout the diaspora. So he's writing about the United States and the Caribbean and Brazil. So Du Bois was very tremendous influence on me. And I think too often when we look back at history and we judge leaders, particularly leaders that were in these confrontations and had these conflicts, I think we tend to take sides. And to me, it's not necessarily a situation where we have to take sides. I prefer to look at it as Garvey made his contributions, Du Bois made his contributions, and we can learn from the different contributions that both men made, and we could respect both of those contributions. And I don't think we should be put in a situation where, because we have a bias towards one leader over the other, that we necessarily have to dismiss or diminish the contributions of the other leaders. So I just want to put it out here before I get to publishing the article, that my defense of Garvey is not intended to be a criticism or a dismissal of Du Bois and the tremendous things I think he accomplished, and even some of the contributions he made to the anti-colonial struggle as well. That I'll mention here that when Henry Sylvester Williams organized his first Pan-African conference, it was not an anti-colonial conference. His perception of Pan-Africanism was not anti-colonialism. Du Bois connected Pan-Africanism to anti-colonialism. So when Du Bois is doing his Pan-African congresses, one of the goals that Du Bois has in mind is self-governance for Africa. That's essentially anti-colonialism. So I do recognize that when we talk about the history of the anti-colonial movement, that certainly, Garvey had made a bigger impact in terms of the scope of his impact on the anti-colonial struggle, but that's not to dismiss or diminish what Du Bois contributed to the anti-colonial struggle as well.
No question. No question. I think you're right. And when I read what you said about the organizer point, I took it as a matter of fact and unworthy of, like, it wasn't even I don't even think I raised an eyebrow now that you mention it, because it's if particularly if you're talking about targeting and building a Black organization, you would have to acknowledge Garvey as more successful, even if you don't agree with his political project. He was clearly more successful. I acknowledge my political enemies are better at organizing those I want to argue or organize than I am. So it's, anyway. Like I said, I appreciate you. And yeah, I'm glad we got to have this little building session, and I look forward to more.
Definitely look forward to more as well.
So we'll follow up and go from there. And unless I'm missing anything specific for us in the chat, yeah. But not here, but not a battle here. And I like I said, I definitely appreciate that. I have zero. It's different from having zero issues with. I want to encourage more of that kind of engagement, not just with me or us, but just in general. So I appreciate you. Anyway. All right, my man. Please, everybody, check the link in the show description to get to more of Dwayne Omowale's work. And hopefully you'll be seeing more and hearing more about it here on this platform sooner than later. But Dwayne, thanks again for coming through.
Thank you for inviting me.
And to all the rest of you, thank you for coming through. And to those who will see and hear this later, thanks to you as well. And as always, as Fred Hampton used to say to we say peace only if you're willing to fight for it. So catch you next time here at I Mix What I Like and throughout the BPM channel and platform. Peace, everybody. I mix what I like, what I like, what I like, what I like, what I like.